In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Henry David Thoreau Walden Pond. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a very dark blue, amplified by the extreme sheen found on nicer papers. Sadly for sheen lovers, this sheen doesn't always come through on much cheaper or non-fountain pen paper. However, it can. Sometimes the sheen force is so strong with this, it can't be held back by a more absorbent paper. For sheen lovers, this is a beast. The red sheen over that dark blue can make this change colors from a dark blue to a dark purple with changing light. It is a very cool chameleon-like effect. Now, of the 4 pens used, I did have one that hard started. And to be clear, I let all those pens sit for almost a week before I went to film this because I heard hard starting could be an issue. Only one had the hard starting issues, and once it got going, there was nothing. This is a real must-have for sheen lovers out there, without a doubt. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Jinhao 51A with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get that very dark blue until you turn this just a little bit. Then you start seeing that sheen, making it into a very nice dark purple. We get no feather, we get no spread. We don't get the shading because the sheen is really there to take its place. And I think it looks really nice. Now, you're not seeing it because it's the voiceover, but I'm rubbing on this, and I am not getting it to move, even after I let it sit for just a day. Looking at the broad nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, no spread, sheen like a beast. You really don't get that blue tone at all. Everything I get here is that dark purple from the blue and the red sheen together. Very interesting in how it's performing, and you do get to see some of this change as it moves around in the light. Looking at the stub nib, we get mostly the same tones that we had with the broad. We get no feather, we get no spread. Now again, it's not shade, but it's going to be sheen here. We get areas with and without sheen, so it's like it's performing like shade. It does really well. That stub nib in what it was doing really makes, instead of shading, that sheen bring out a whole lot more in what I'm writing than what I actually wrote. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. A Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, it is not as dark as we had on the Clairfontaine. However, we're still getting that sheen. Very interesting, because this is such an absorbent paper. We get no feather, we get no spread. That sheen is very consistent the whole way through. So we're really getting very much that purple. And it looks really cool. The fact that it's coming through on this paper is such a shock. I really wasn't expecting it at all, and it's done so well with it. Looking at the broad nib, it certainly looks darker than we had with the fine. Now, looks darker is this whole kind of how the sheen is playing effect. We get no feather, we get no spread, and again, instead of shading, we get a very consistent sheen the entire way through. It is not as dark a purple as we had with the Clairfontaine. This is a very cool looking purple tone that I'm seeing. I just know of no way to truly get it to show on camera. Looking at the stub nib, which is going to have a tendency to spread the ink a little bit thinner, we get no feather, we get no spread. The tone itself is certainly much lighter than we had with the broad, probably about what we had with the fine. Now, instead of that shading, again, we have sheen, and it is sheening in and out as if it was shading and doing a very strong job at keeping the sheen alive. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting, doing such a great job here. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a much lighter tone than we've gotten before. Now, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread, we're not getting the sheen, we're not getting the shading. It's nice on this paper, it looks nice. It just looks like a nice dark blue here. The absorbency of this paper was able to defeat the sheen powers of this ink. Looking at the broad nib, we get some light feathering that's going to go on. Absolutely manageable. We're not getting any kind of spread. And this is the revenge of the sheen paper, or the sheen powers, because it's definitely back with the broad. So that more ink going down is definitely helping to bring it out here. I don't know that it's something you worry about with this, but the sheen is strong enough to defeat even this paper. Looking at the stub nib, we get a tone that's lighter than we had with the broad, a little bit darker than the fine. We're getting almost no feathering. Really, any of the feathers that show up are incredibly tiny, not really worth a problem. We get no spread. We're not getting the sheen. The sheen is lost out. We're not getting any shading. It's just here, and an unfortunate byproduct on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, there are some areas where you can see the ink got a little deeper in there. However, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. You can easily use the back of this page. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we see that we get no feather, no spread, no shading. The sheen is not coming through, although it's not really looking just as a dark blue. It looks to be a little bit of something else, and I really have turned this into light a bunch of ways to see if what I'm seeing is an effect of that sheen, and if it is, I can't tell, but it's not just a dark blue that I'm seeing here. It's definitely not the sheen. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the fine. We get no feather, no spread, no shade, no sheen. This paper is crushing the sheen power of this ink and doing it very well. Now, the tone itself, I actually don't mind in where it's at. I think it's pretty good. I just don't think it looks as nice from the broad on this paper, but I do think the tone is really good. If I could have had that tone from the fine, probably would have been a whole lot happier about it. Looking at the stub nib, we're getting no feather, we're getting no spread. We get a tone that is darker than the fine, but not as dark as the broad. The sheen, crushed by this paper. Now, this paper is generally performed very well, but it is not made for fountain pens, so I don't expect it to really perform at higher levels with it. The sheen killed here, which I'm a little surprised. Based on the last paper, I thought this one would hold up pretty well. Looking at the back of the page, you see a lot of ghosting. I don't know if you could use the back of this page really comfortably if you were using the same ink, but there was nothing that bled through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Blackstone Sydney Harbor Blue. Here is Diatramentis Sigmund Freud Sapphire Blue. Here is Diamine Shimmering Seas. Here is Monteverde Malibu Blue. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it has tiny feathers. The feathers aren't the issue. It spreads definitely to a little bit more than we get from a medium. We get no shading. We get no sheen. We get a dark blue that doesn't look like anything special, but it is a dark blue and it is working, so it has that going for it. Really a problem with this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. We get feather. We get spread to, I almost want to call it like it's doing the Pelican double broad. This is ridiculous amounts of spread. There's no shading. There's no sheen. This is a horrible ink to use on this paper, or more specifically, a horrible paper to use with this ink. Looking at the marker, stub nib, we get feathering. Yes, it's not the worst. We get spread, tons. It's a marker. No shading, no sheen. The tone is just a little bit lighter than there was with the broad. Certainly darker than there was with the fine. I'm looking forward to really using this paper for the rest of the year and then never again. Looking at the page underneath, you see the massive amount of circling that I did because it constantly corrupted that page. Looking at the back of the page, you see why with the tremendous amount of ghosting. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a red ink by Papier Plume, their Lover's Red. Here is an orange shimmering ink by Diamine, their Caramel Sparkle. Here is a magenta ink by Noodlers, their Black Swan and Australian Rose. Here is a yellow ink by Pen BBS, their number 184. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, this performed much better than on the last paper. There is a tiny bit of feathering. I think the feathering's incredibly manageable. There is a little bit of spread, but not too bad. I actually think this is fairly good to use on this paper. So the paper is doing very well. Of course, we're not going to get any kind of shading, and of course the sheen isn't going to come through. Your major properties are lost, but it's doing very well. Looking at the broad nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the fine. It's very evident not to use this with a broad nib on this paper. We get a lot of feathering, we get a lot of spread, we get no shading, we get no sheen, we get gross, horrible looking handwriting that... it's bad. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the broad. We get feather, we get spread. Both should be expected when dealing with this paper. Since they're expected, having them is not any kind of a letdown. It's almost like tiny little victories shooting out from every letter in all directions, continuously. No shading, no sheen, nothing of real interest. Very, very dark blue, though. Looking at the page underneath, you can see a ton of spots where I circled because it entirely corrupts the next page. And you see why when you see the amount of ghosting, you can't use the back of the page. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? On nice paper, the sheen never fails to come through. So it can be achieved with any pen, making this really a dealer's choice for all of the sheen lovers that are out there. But I do feel that the sheen was most noticeable. It stood out the best in the broad. I will say that for me it was actually that Lamy Fine that I thought the writing looked the best with the sheen. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.